Today's lesson, Chapter 14, Section 1, The Nation's Sick Economy. To get started, let's talk about our learning objectives, things we want to get down by the end of this screencast. To start with, we have critical problems that are threatening America's economy in the late 1920s. The superficial prosperity that we've previously talked about is then going to come into play here. And similar, as we look at our next objective, the causes of the stock market crash and the Great Depression, this is going to be very similar to the causes of World War I. If you remember our acronym of MAIN, there are four causes, underlying factors, and it's then the one key event, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that starts World War I. The same concept can be applied here to the Great Depression as well. As we'll see, during the 1920s, there are a handful of issues and problems that are being overlooked, and when the stock market does crash, it's these factors that will then compound it to make it a Great Depression. And finally, as we look at our last objective, we'll see that the Great Depression will not only be a problem that Americans are dealing with, but this problem will become global as well. Starting off with key industries start to slow down. Now, some of this is going to be related back to World War I, as we saw America increase production to help out the Allies through the 4 years of fighting. But as World War I comes to an end and those countries start to go back to their normal production, Americans' products are not going to be as needed as much. And so we'll see some slowdown in some of those industries, and some of this will also then be related to technology improvements here in America as we get away from trains and start to go more towards automobiles. And so we'll definitely see a slowdown as far as railroads are concerned. Housing starts dropped as well. Think back to Chapter 6 when we talked about railroads, and we said people moving out west, this idea of manifest destiny, conquering the land, setting up homes, and how that was good for the American economy. As people bought houses, they then needed to buy the products to fill those houses. And if we look at our graph here, we can see, that during the 1920s, housing starts are increasing. And then once we get halfway through the decade, we see it hit a peak. And as this starts to then come to a decline, we can then fast forward to 1929 when the stock market actually crashes. But the housing starts start to slow down, and therefore the economy starts to slow down. Farmers are also going to be in trouble during the 1920s. During World War I, similar to our industrial demand, demand for crops are going to go up as well. And so farmers will increase production to meet that wartime demand. And we'll see at the end of the war in 1920, farmers will not adjust, they will not slow down their production, and therefore prices are going to plummet. Similar to what happened to the Populist Party and the farmers back in the late 1800s. So let's take a closer look at this. If we can see the production in the red lines, there's natural ups and downs, but the trend is going up. 1914 to 1920, you can see by the time we hit 1920, production is at an all-time high for farmers. But World War I ends in 1919. Take a look at our blue line here, which is going to be the price. In 1919, when the war is over with and other foreign nations start to go back to producing their own products, their own corn or wheat, whatever it's going to be, the price then drops significantly for farmers, almost cut in half from what it was to what it's going to be. Another way of looking at this of supply and demand is when supply goes up, price goes down. As supply goes down, price increases. And as we get into the 1900s, as production increases drastically, we see the drop off in price drops to match that as well. So farmers during the 1920s are going to call for aid, help from the government through price supports, which are going to guarantee set prices for a crop. So it's kind of the bare minimum you can be paid per bushel of corn. During the 1920s, under our Republican leadership, Calvin Coolidge is going to veto this and say farmers are kind of on their own. Americans living on credit. We've talked about all the new fancy products that are available during the 1920s. Americans are starting to get those without actually having the cash to pay for them. And so they're living on the installment plan. They're buying the product, they're going to the store, they're getting it, they're bringing it home, and then they have monthly payments that they have to make in order to pay off the full price. We also see a very wide disparity in the distribution of wealth. Looking at our graph here, you can see 65% of Americans have less than $2,000 per year as an income. You have 1% of Americans making $10,000 or more, and you have 0.1% of Americans who are making $100,000 or more. If we're looking for connections between the Great Depression and another time, we can then look very closely to what happened in 2008 with the housing bubble burst. So let's take a look at our chart and see how that factors in together. In 1923, so during the 20s, we see the top 1% of Americans having about 70% of the wealth in the country, while the bottom 90% are under 20% of the wealth. Fast forward then to the early 2000s, leading up to our housing bubble crash in 2008, and you see the top 1% of Americans having over 60% of the wealth, while the bottom 90% are hovering, I would say, probably about 14% of the wealth is going to be owned by them. So we have this large disparity between the rich and the poor. The rich are really rich, and the poor are pretty poor. Important year, 1928, we have the election of Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover is an interesting man, being from Iowa, somebody we know. But prior to this point, he had never been elected to any position ever. He'd always just been appointed. And so it's kind of unfamiliar territory for him. The one thing Herbert Hoover has going for him is that he's a Republican. And he can then tell the American people, hey, the 1920s, the superficial prosperity that's going on, is under Republican leadership. If you elect me, I will continue those same ideas that have made America great or good or prosperous. And so, as you can see from our map here, Herbert Hoover wins